There are moments in life that stop time, not slow it down, not stretch it. Stop it completely. What happened on the night of September 15th, 1975, at the Mid-South Coliseum in Memphis, Tennessee, was one of those moments, and the people who were there never stopped talking about it for the rest of their lives. Elvis Presley was in the middle of his second show of the evening. 18,000 people had packed that arena to see the king of rock and roll do what he did better than anyone alive. The lights were blazing. The crowd was electric. Elvis was moving across that stage like a man who owned the air around him, and for the first hour, everything was exactly what those 18,000 people had paid to see. Then it stopped. Not the music, not the lights, not the crowd noise. Something else stopped, something invisible but real, something that every single person in that building felt in their chest before they understood it with their mind. Elvis Presley, the most famous performer on the planet, stood at the edge of his stage, looked down into the audience, and went completely still. Then his knees buckled. The band kept playing for 3 full seconds before the musicians realized what was happening. The crowd kept screaming for 2 seconds after that, and then, one by one, 18,000 people fell silent. Because Elvis Presley was not performing anymore. He was not the king of rock and roll in that moment. He was just a man who had just heard something that broke him open in front of the entire world. What did he hear? That is the question that has followed this story for 50 years. The answer is not what you expect. It never is when a child is involved. And tonight, you are going to hear every word of it. Stay with us. This one matters. To understand what happened that night, you have to understand who Elvis was in September of 1975. Not the legend, not the icon, the man. He was 40 years old. He had been performing for 21 years. His body was carrying more than it was built to hold. His knees ached from thousands of nights on stage. His heart, doctors had quietly told his inner circle, was working harder than it should. He was sleeping only a few hours a night, sustained by a combination of sheer will and medications that his physician kept prescribing without asking enough questions. Elvis knew something was wrong. He had known for a while, but stopping was not something Elvis Presley knew how to do. Those people in the seats, he told his road manager Joe Esposito, are the reason I breathe. You don't let the reason you breathe down. So he kept going. That night in Memphis, Elvis had already performed 1 full concert. He had gone back to his dressing room, changed his jumpsuit, splashed cold water on his face, and walked back out for a second show, because that was who he was, and because 18,000 people were waiting. In the 3rd row of that arena, slightly left of center, sat a family of 3. A man named Robert Calloway, his wife Diane, and between them, wrapped in a fleece blanket despite the heat of the arena, sat their 7-year-old son. His name was Thomas. Tommy, his parents called him. He was wearing an Elvis t-shirt that was 2 sizes too large because his small body had lost so much weight in the past year that nothing fit him properly anymore. On his head sat a blue baseball cap, pulled low, covering the baldness that the chemotherapy had left behind. Tommy Calloway had been diagnosed with leukemia 18 months earlier. He had fought it with everything a 7-year-old body possessed. But by September of 1975, the fight was nearly over. His doctors had spoken to Robert and Diane 3 days before that concert with the kind of quiet, careful voices that doctors use when they have nothing left to offer. They estimated Tommy had between 1 week and 2 weeks remaining. They suggested the family take him home and make him comfortable. They suggested the family give him whatever he asked for. Tommy asked for one thing. He wanted to see Elvis. Robert Calloway was not a man who asked for help. He had grown up in rural Tennessee, the son of a farmer, raised on the belief that a man handled his own problems quietly and without complaint. He had never written a fan letter in his life. He had never called a radio station. He had never once asked a stranger for anything he couldn't earn himself. But on the morning of September 13th, 1975, Robert Calloway sat down at the kitchen table after Tommy had fallen asleep, and he wrote a letter. He wrote it by hand on plain white paper, and he addressed it to the Mid-South Coliseum in Memphis, Tennessee, to the attention of anyone who might read it. He wrote about Tommy. He wrote about the leukemia. He wrote about the morning Tommy had woken up and said, "Daddy, I want to hear Elvis sing Can't Help Falling in Love one time before I go." He wrote that sentence exactly as Tommy had spoken it. Before I go. A 7-year-old boy who understood exactly what was happening to him and had made peace with it in a way that his father had not yet been able to do. Robert drove that letter to the Coliseum himself and handed it to a security guard at the service entrance. He did not know if anyone would read it. He drove home and did not tell Diane what he had done because he did not want to give her hope he wasn't sure he could deliver. 2 days later, at 11 o'clock in the morning, the phone rang. It was a member of Elvis's advance team. 3 tickets had been set aside. 3rd row. EACB. Answer occur. Not center, but close enough to see every expression on Elvis's face. Robert sat down on the kitchen floor when he hung up the phone and cried for 10 minutes before he composed himself enough to go tell his wife. Getting Tommy to that arena was its own kind of battle. He was exhausted by the car ride alone. His pain levels had increased significantly in the past week, and the medication that managed them also made him drowsy and slow. But the moment they walked through those arena doors and Tommy heard the distant sound of the warm-up music, something changed in that small boy. His eyes opened wider. His grip on his father's hand tightened. He looked up at Robert and said, "Daddy, I can feel him already." Robert Calloway did not trust himself to speak. He simply picked his son up and carried him to their seats. For the first 40 minutes of the concert, Tommy was more alive than he had been in months. He was mouthing the words to every song. He was swaying gently against his father's arm. Diane watched him with the particular expression that parents wear when they are trying to memorize a moment while it is still happening. Because she knew, the way mothers always know, that moments like this one were almost gone. Then Elvis began the opening notes of Can't Help Falling in Love, and Tommy Calloway leaned forward in his seat and started to cry. They were not sad tears. That was the first thing Diane noticed. Tommy was not crying the way he cried when the pain got too bad or when he woke frightened in the night. These were different tears. They were the tears of someone who had waited a very long time for something and was finally, completely receiving it. He was leaning forward with both small hands gripping the back of the seat in front of him, his thin body trembling slightly, his eyes locked on the stage with an intensity that made him look older than 7. Older than most people in that arena. Elvis was midway through the song when it happened. Tommy turned to his father. He tugged Robert's sleeve with the quiet urgency that sick children develop, that particular way of asking for something when they are too tired to use full sentences. Robert leaned down, and Tommy whispered something into his father's ear. 4 words. Robert's face changed instantly. He looked at his wife. Diane saw his expression and immediately understood that something had shifted. Robert stood up. He lifted Tommy into his arms, and he began moving toward the stage. Security moved to intercept them within seconds. A guard stepped forward, hand raised, ready to redirect this father and his sick child back to their seats. But Robert Calloway looked at that guard with the eyes of a man who had already lost everything that mattered and had nothing left to protect except this one moment. The guard stepped aside. Robert reached the barrier at the edge of the stage. He was close enough now that the stage lights were hitting Tommy's face directly. Close enough that when Tommy reached one thin arm upward toward the stage, the gesture was impossible to miss. Elvis saw it. He was still singing. His eyes had been moving across the crowd the way they always did, that practiced sweep of connection that made 18,000 people each feel individually chosen. And then his eyes landed on Tommy Calloway, on the small arm reaching upward, on the blue baseball cap, on the face beneath it. Elvis's voice continued for exactly 3 more words. Then it stopped. He walked to the edge of the stage. He crouched down so that he was at eye level with the child in Robert Calloway's arms. The band played on behind him for a moment, uncertain. Then, one by one, the musicians trailed off until the arena was holding a silence so complete it had weight. 18,000 people stopped moving. stopped talking, stopped breathing, it seemed, because something was happening at the edge of that stage that every single one of them recognized without being told. Something real, something that had nothing to do with performance. Elvis looked at Tommy for a long moment. Then he said quietly into a microphone that was still clipped to his collar, "What did you want to tell me, son?" And Tommy Calloway, 7 years old, 2 weeks from the end of his life, looked Elvis Presley directly in the eyes and said the 4 words he had whispered to his father. The 4 words Robert had carried him through that crowd to deliver in person. The words were not a request. They were not a plea. They were a statement, spoken with the calm certainty of a child who had already decided what was true. He said, "You are not alone." Elvis Presley collapsed, not dramatically, not the way it happens in films. His legs simply gave way beneath him slowly, like a man who had been standing for a very long time and had finally been given permission to sit down. He went to one knee on the edge of that stage. His hand came up to cover his mouth. His shoulders shook once. Then he bent his head, and the king of rock and roll wept in front of 18,000 people without making a single sound. No one in that arena moved. No one spoke. A child had just told the most famous man in the world that he was not alone. And the most famous man in the world had needed to hear it more than anyone watching could have possibly known. What happened in the next few minutes was described differently by everyone who witnessed it. Some said Elvis was helped to his feet by his guitarist Charlie Hodge, who had rushed to the edge of the stage the moment Elvis went down. Some said Elvis rose on his own, slowly, with the deliberate steadiness of a man who had made a decision. What everyone agreed on was what happened next. Elvis reached down over the edge of the stage. Robert Calloway lifted Tommy upward, and Elvis Presley took that 7-year-old boy into his arms and stood up. He held Tommy the way you hold something you are afraid of breaking. Carefully, completely. One large hand supporting the boy's back, the other cradling his head the way you cradle a sleeping child when you are carrying them to bed. Tommy's thin arms went around Elvis's neck. His blue baseball cap was slightly crooked. His eyes were closed. Elvis turned to face the arena. 18,000 people saw this. A giant of a man, dressed in a white jeweled jumpsuit, holding a tiny sick boy as if that child were the most important thing he had ever been handed. Which, in that moment, he was. Elvis did not speak for a long moment. When he did, his voice was rough and uneven in a way that voice had never been before in public. He said, "This young man just reminded me of something I had forgotten." He said it simply, without explanation, because no explanation was needed. Everyone in that building understood. Then Elvis carried Tommy to the piano at the center of the stage. He sat down on the bench. He settled Tommy carefully onto his lap. Tommy opened his eyes and looked out at the crowd, at 18,000 faces all turned toward him, and he did not look frightened. He looked peaceful. He looked, his mother said later, like a boy who had arrived exactly where he was supposed to be. Elvis began to play, softly at first. The opening notes of "Love Me Tender" moved through that silent arena like something being poured slowly into a room. And then Elvis sang, not the performance version, not the concert version with its careful dynamics and practiced emotion. He sang it the way you sing to a child at the end of a long day, quietly, honestly, like a man with nothing left to hide. Tommy did not sing along. He simply leaned his head against Elvis's chest and closed his eyes again. And Elvis sang to him, just to him, while 18,000 people sat completely still and bore witness to something they would spend the rest of their lives trying to describe to people who weren't there. When the song ended, the silence lasted a full 10 seconds before anyone in that arena made a sound. After the applause faded, Elvis carried Tommy back to his parents. He did not hand him over quickly. He held him for one extra moment, his face close to the boy's ear, and he whispered something. Nobody heard what it was. Robert and Diane never shared it publicly. Tommy never repeated it. Whatever Elvis said in that moment belonged entirely to the child he said it to, and that privacy was its own kind of gift. What happened backstage after the concert was quieter than anyone expected. Elvis did not throw a celebration. He did not call his friends or pour drinks or replay the moment for his crew. He asked Joe Esposito to bring the Calloway family to his dressing room, and when they arrived, Elvis was sitting alone on a small couch with his jacket off and his hands folded in his lap. He looked, according to Robert Calloway, like a man who had just woken up from a long sleep. They sat together for nearly an hour. Elvis asked Tommy questions about his favorite songs, his favorite foods, the television shows he watched from his hospital bed. Tommy answered each one with the careful seriousness of a child who understood that this conversation was important. At one point, Tommy reached up and removed his blue baseball cap and placed it on Elvis's head without saying a word. Elvis left it there for the rest of the evening. Before the family left, Elvis took Robert aside. He spoke to him privately for several minutes. Robert never repeated the full details of that conversation either, but he said this much years later in a quiet interview that very few people ever found. He said Elvis told him that Tommy's 4 words had reached him in a place that nothing had reached in years, and that he was grateful, not as a performer. As a man, Tommy Calloway passed away 11 days after that concert. He died at home, in his own bed, with his parents beside him and an Elvis record playing softly in the next room. He was wearing the scarf Elvis had placed around his small shoulders before the family left the arena that night. His mother said he fell asleep mid-song and did not wake up. She said it was the most peaceful thing she had ever witnessed. Elvis never spoke about that night publicly. He did not give interviews about it. He did not reference it on stage. But Charlie Hodge, who was with Elvis for the final 2 years of his life, said that something changed in Elvis after September 15, 1975. He said Elvis became quieter, more present, more willing to simply sit with people rather than perform for them. He said the blue baseball cap appeared on Elvis's bedside table at Graceland not long after that night and that it never moved from that spot. When Elvis died on August 16, 1977, the cap was still there. A 7-year-old boy who had 2 weeks to live had looked at the most famous man in the world and told him he was not alone. He had given Elvis something that no concert, no crowd, and no amount of fame had ever been able to provide. He had given him the truth, simple, quiet, and completely free. Sometimes the smallest voice in the room carries the most important thing anyone in that room has ever needed to hear. Tommy Calloway knew that, and because of him, so did Elvis. Thank you for being here tonight.